There are moments when a single word can choke a person's life. Like when Jonah Hale, a cowboy living in the sand, stood before the only woman who brought warmth to his home and said harshly, "Pack up your things. Leave here before dawn." But what he didn't know was that the quiet chef carried a secret in his heart that would change everything he believed about himself forever. If it were you, would you choose to leave in silence? Or would you stay for a second to say what your heart has been hiding? Would you dare to trust someone again? After a lifetime of isolation and hurt, each of us, at some point, has to choose between fear and hope. And sometimes, just a confession is enough to save a soul from being broken. We invite you to step into a story filled with silences, old wounds, and gentle courage, buried deep in the vast West. If you feel something touches your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more healing stories. Mornings on the edge of the Bighorn Mountains always come slowly, as if the sun lingers behind the high slopes to survey the vast landscape a little longer. A thin mist hangs no more than 3 feet above the ground, creating a chill around the weathered wooden fences. At Hale Creek Ranch, that chill seeps into every crack and crevice of the old cabin, and sometimes even into the souls of the people who live here. Jonah Hale stood still on the porch, his strong hand holding a cup of hot black coffee, the steam rising in the cold morning air. He bowed his head slightly, watching the heat fade before it dissipated. The smell of coffee, pine, and damp earth blended into the familiar scent of a middle-aged cowboy who had passed too many years. Jonah's face was grim, not because of anger, but because he was used to keeping all his emotions inside, where no one could see and no one could touch. From where he stood, Jonah could see most of the ranch, stretching some 300 yards to the south, the once white fences now dark, the old wagon he used to haul hay, and the small stable beside the dirt road that led to the town of Silver Brush, 12 miles away. Once, things had been more lively. When his wife was alive, there had been a whistling sound, soft footsteps on the porch, her calling him to breakfast every morning. But that was 5 years ago, before the winter fire had suddenly claimed the gentlewoman and a large portion of his herd. From that day on, the house became strangely quiet, so quiet that sometimes Jonah felt as if he were living in a place no one else visited. Many men in their 40s in the West lived alone, but not all of them were as lonely as he. Some nights, Jonah lay listening to the wind rustling through the boards, the creaking of the windows, the light tap of fireflies against the glass. He was not afraid of ghosts. He was afraid of memories. The morning was like any other, until Jonah heard the sound of pots and pans coming from the kitchen. It wasn't loud, but it carried a warm feeling, something Jonah had almost forgotten. Martha Lee was cleaning the kitchen. She had arrived at Hale Creek Ranch 3 weeks ago, after Jonah had found himself too exhausted to work in the fields and run the kitchen. Martha didn't say much, and never entered his space without being asked. But the way she moved about the house, gentle and considerate, brightened the kitchen in a casual way. Jonah stood in the doorway that day, still holding his coffee cup, watching the steady fire in the stove. Martha had started the fire with dry pine logs. Her hair was tied back, a few strands of gray mixed in with the dark brown. She wore a thick ash-gray sweater and a blue-striped cotton apron, the proper attire for a woman who had seen much hardship in the West. For 3 weeks, she had never laughed aloud, but she had never complained either. Martha Lee brought a different kind of silence, a warm silence, but it was this silence that made Jonah uneasy. He didn't know why. "Your coffee will get cold," Martha said quietly, without turning her head. Her voice was small, but clear and unshaken. Jonah was a little startled. He didn't understand how she knew he was standing there. "I drink quickly," he replied, his voice low and hoarse like rotten wood. Martha said nothing more. She continued stacking the wooden bowls, her movements slow and precise, reminding Jonah of his wife. That careful routine had kept the kitchen neat, as if each object had a place that no one could move. He turned and walked out into the yard, but stopped after 5 steps. His eyes drifted involuntarily to the kitchen window, where Martha was tying a kitchen towel between 2 wooden hangers, and, to his surprise, the way she had tied it was exactly the way his wife had done it. Jonah took a deep breath. A pang rose in his chest. Not pain, nor joy. Just something he had been holding in for a long time and didn't want to let out. At 46, Jonah was not a man to be swayed. He was accustomed to living alone, to the sound of wind rather than people, to working long hours with no conversation but his horses. Martha came, bringing a warmth that was small but enough to stir something dormant inside him. As he walked to the east fence to check the barbed wire, the sun was beginning to spread across the meadow. This was when things really took off the golden grass. The swirling dust in the wind, the sound of hooves echoing from the old stables. Jonah watched it all with eyes that had seen so much change. But this morning he sensed something different, something that made him wary. Not that Martha was being a nuisance. She never was. It was her silence that made him uneasy. The West teaches people that the silent ones are often the ones who suffer the most. And sometimes they are also the ones who make their hearts vibrate the strongest. Hale Creek Ranch, though still ashes of the past, suddenly felt like it was breathing new life. But Jonah Hale was not a man to open up easily. He just stood there, his hand on the fence, his eyes on the lighted kitchen, wondering a question he could not answer. Why am I so afraid of this? A cold wind blew across, carrying the scent of pine and road dust. Jonah stood a moment longer, then turned back into the house, preparing for the long day ahead. But inside him, a small change was beginning, a transformation that neither he nor Martha saw coming, but which would eventually lead to more than just warm meals in the small kitchen. It will lead them to a decision that will change their lives, forever. Though the wind still whistled through the old wood of Hale Creek Ranch as it always did, Jonah sensed something strange in the air as he returned to the porch. There were moments of silence that made you feel like you were missing something important. And that morning, as he entered the room, a wave of that feeling washed over him. The kitchen was quiet, but no longer had its usual emptiness. Martha Lee stood in front of the small window overlooking the yard. She placed the bowl of cake batter on the wooden table, her hands still covered in white flour. The light shone on her face, revealing a very slight fatigue, the look of a woman who had lived a life of hardships, but still tried to maintain her composure. Jonah knocked lightly on the door as if to announce his entrance. Martha turned, her eyes calm, but occasionally seeming to ripple and dissipate. She asked if he wanted more coffee. Jonah gave a small nod and walked over to the worn wooden table. He saw the new kitchen towel, neatly folded, placed exactly where his wife had left it. It was a small detail, but enough to make his heart sink. Not because the old pain had returned, but because the coincidence puzzled him. Jonah didn't want to be too harsh, but he also didn't want to admit that it made his heart skip a beat. As Jonah surveyed the room, Martha let out a soft breath, almost too low for him to hear. She said, in a low voice, that she would fix a door hinge after she finished cooking. Jonah frowned and asked why she wouldn't let him do it. Martha said she was used to doing things quietly. That made Jonah pause. People who were too quiet always made him feel like something was wrong, but he didn't want to interfere too much. He turned his eyes to the clock on the wall. The minute hand was still ticking steadily, but the ticking sound was louder than usual. Jonah noticed that in the absence of other noise, Martha seemed more cautious, as if she were trying to avoid disturbing the space, a feeling that made him think there was more to her than she let on. Jonah went to the closet to get his leather jacket. As he was about to check the north fence, Martha stopped and asked if he needed water. Her voice was soft, But there was something about her that was habitual, the habit of someone who had been worrying about others for so long. Jonah didn't know how to respond, so he just said he was used to it. Martha nodded and said nothing more. As Jonah was about to leave, a faint sound came from the iron skillet. Martha turned and placed it on the rack. She bowed slightly as he passed. Jonah paused, not out of politeness, but because he sensed something fragile in the air. Before he could say anything, Martha spoke up. "Do you need me to prepare anything for tonight?" Jonah said no. She nodded, smiling slightly. It wasn't a happy smile. It was more like an old habit than a natural response. When Jonah stepped outside, the first thing he saw was Caleb leading a brown horse across the yard. Caleb was his old friend, growing up together in Silverbrush, a jovial, outgoing man, the complete opposite of Jonah. Caleb was the type of man who put a woman at ease with the first greeting. It sometimes annoyed Jonah, though he would never admit it. Caleb saw Jonah and smiled broadly. He asked Jonah if he wanted any help today. Jonah said he could handle it. Caleb shrugged, as if he was used to that answer. But when Martha opened the kitchen door to hang towels to dry, Caleb immediately gave her a friendly wave. "Good morning, Martha," she answered softly, her voice low but warm. Jonah watched the scene with a look that was not too clear, but something tightened, not because of jealousy. Jonah was not a person who was jealous easily, but he was uncomfortable seeing Martha smiling lightly at someone, while with him, she only smiled when absolutely necessary. Caleb asked Martha if he could carry her stuff from town for the weekend. Martha tried to refuse, but Caleb continued to joke, saying Jonah's wagon was too old to make her walk far. Martha laughed, and it was the first time Jonah had heard her laugh out loud. It was a very short, very soft sound, but it was enough to make him look away. Caleb saw the change in Jonah's face, but didn't ask anything. He just winked at Jonah and went back to his work. Jonah walked towards the fence, but his mind was no longer focused on his work as usual. The image of Martha standing at the door, her slightly sad eyes, her thin smile, all of it passed through his mind in no particular order. He wondered why he paid so much attention to the details. Jonah was not that sentimental, and certainly not the type to be moved by a small smile. He tried to concentrate on checking the old fence, but every time he heard Caleb's voice in the distance, or the sound of the kitchen door opening, he found himself looking in that direction. What troubled him most was not Martha's presence, but the fact that she made him feel that he was no longer alone in this house. And that was what made him feel uneasy. He was afraid that the warm feeling would disappear again, afraid of repeating the pain he had experienced. When Jonah returned to the house, Martha was setting some vegetables on the table. She saw him and asked if he would like something to eat before he went back to the fields. Jonah declined, but his voice was softer than usual. Martha nodded, her eyes softening slightly. In that moment, Jonah realized something he couldn't accept. Martha Lee wasn't just in the house. She was slowly entering a space he had locked away for years, and that, unspoken, began to change him in ways he never expected. The cabin at Hale Creek Ranch had its quietest moments when no one was trying to make a sound. At those times, every footstep, every breath, every door opening felt like it was touching something fragile. Jonah Hale had never been one to pay much attention to the atmosphere in his home, but with Martha Lee's arrival, he began to notice things he had previously considered insignificant. That afternoon in the kitchen, Martha was cutting potatoes and preparing some soup. She leaned slightly to one side, her hair loose from its bun, her hands working harder than her calm exterior suggested. Jonah stood near the door, neither entering nor leaving. He just watched, and suddenly wondered when the kitchen had stopped being so cold. There was something about Martha's presence that enlivened the space, even though she rarely spoke or made a fuss. But Jonah was not used to such sudden warmth. The warmth stirred an old fear, It reminded him of what he had lost. In Silver Brush, news spread like wildfire. No one knew where it started, but within days, rumors began to swirl around the town about Jonah and his new cook. Some said Jonah was so lonely that he kept Martha around for more than just cooking. Others said Martha was taking advantage of a widower's kindness to find shelter. The whispers grew, reaching even the quietest ears. Caleb, in a Silver Brush bar, overheard some unpleasant comments. He frowned, hearing just enough to be annoyed, but not enough to quell the rumors. Caleb had always liked Martha, and he knew she wasn't someone who would take advantage of anyone. But his concern for Jonah was greater, because he knew Jonah's silence wasn't often calm, but something like a wall so thick that emotions were trapped inside. When Caleb arrived at the ranch that day, he found Martha hanging a towel near the porch. The breeze was blowing, making her robe flutter. She greeted him with a somewhat hesitant smile. Perhaps she was used to being cautious when interacting with people. Caleb didn't mind. He tried to keep his voice cheerful, asking a few questions about the cooking. Jonah stepped out into the yard as Caleb was talking. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but being so close made it inevitable. And the smile on Martha's face made him stop. Not because he was jealous in the conventional sense, but because he couldn't understand why she was so open with Caleb, when his presence made her so guarded. A sudden, unpleasant thought crossed his mind. Perhaps she felt safer with Caleb than with him. The thought made Jonah uneasy. The afternoon passed in a steady stream of noise. Dishes were washed. The fire was lit. Martha's soft footsteps echoed steadily. But in Jonah's mind, nothing was steady. He thought of the rumors that had spread from town. He thought of the way Martha ducked her head whenever anyone looked at her too long. He thought of the fear in her eyes that she tried to hide, and he wondered if her presence by his side was making her miserable in ways he couldn't see. When Jonah returned inside, Martha placed the washed vegetables on the table. She asked if he wanted to leave some for Caleb. Jonah looked at her for a long moment before saying that Caleb said he had eaten in town. Martha nodded, not asking any more questions. But Jonah saw a flicker of confusion in her eyes. Maybe she saw something about Caleb that she didn't want to face. Jonah moved closer to the window, where the light streamed across the room. He saw two shadows on the wooden floor. One was his own, wide and tall, and the other was Martha's, smaller and neater. The shadows were separated by more space than he had expected. Jonah looked down at his hands. The calluses, old and calloused, made him feel he shouldn't, or didn't deserve, to come near that space. He heard Martha clearing the dishes behind him. Something in her movements made him think she was uncomfortable here, not because of the work, but because of the excessive silence of the house, the silence that Jonah had known as companionship, but which Martha sometimes found intruding. He turned and said something he rarely said to her softly. "How have you been sleeping?" Martha was so surprised that she stopped and took a moment to answer. She said she was fine, just having trouble sleeping because she was new to the place. Jonah nodded slowly. He didn't know how to comfort anyone, but he could see she was trying to hide her tiredness. The atmosphere in the small kitchen changed, as if an invisible door had been gently blown open by the wind. No one took the initiative to speak further, but both of them felt a slight tension, not because of anger, but because each of them had something they didn't know how to say. Caleb turned back to say goodbye to Martha before leaving the ranch. Jonah watched from a distance, saying nothing. As Caleb rode away, Jonah noticed Martha watching him for a moment. Not long, but long enough to make him feel uneasy. Not suspicious, not angry, just the feeling that he was losing something he hadn't realized was important. Jonah entered the house with a heavier step than usual. Martha stepped aside to let him pass. He nodded slightly at her, but inside he was a question that kept ringing in his mind, though he didn't want to face it. Martha Lee is feeling like she doesn't belong here. Little did he know that from that moment on, a huge misunderstanding was about to form. A misunderstanding that would change everything between them, in a way no one could have foreseen. The journey from Hale Creek Ranch to Silver Brush was not a long one for someone accustomed to the West, but for Martha Lee, it was still enough silence to allow her thoughts to wander from safety. The dirt road wound gently through the sunburned grass, rutted in places by the wagon wheels. With each jolt, Martha tightened her grip on the rope that held the rice bin to her back. Jonah gave her some money, told her to buy flour, dried beans, and a little salt. He didn't say much, just said that if she got tired, she could stop at the little inn at the edge of town. Martha nodded, looked at his seemingly emotionless face, and silently got into the old carriage. She felt both grateful and like she was going far away from a place she wasn't sure she belonged. Silver Brush appeared ahead, as Caleb always described it. A few low wooden houses with tin roofs, a tavern, a general store, a small church leaning slightly against a row of sparse trees. Time in such places did not move quickly, but news traveled faster than the wind. When Martha pulled up in front of the grocery store, she took a breath before getting out. She wasn't one to draw attention to herself. The moment her hand touched the doorknob, a small bell on the wooden frame jingled. Inside, the smell of sugar, flour, and old leather mingled. The store owner, a plump, middle-aged woman, recognized Martha as new to the area. She smiled politely and asked where Martha worked. Martha answered that she cooked and helped out at Hale Creek Ranch. That one statement made the atmosphere in the room slow a beat. Another woman picking her way around the corner turned, her eyes filled with undisguised curiosity. An old man near the scale looked up, then pretended to be busy with his bag of beans. No one spoke at once, but Martha was used to that kind of silence. She had lived in smaller places than this, and always recognized the moment her name began to slip into someone else's conversation. The shopkeeper asked a few more simple questions, like if Jonah needed anything else, how the animals were doing. They were normal questions, but there was a desire to glean information from them. Martha answered them simply, without adding anything. She felt her heart beat a little faster. As she was reviewing the list in her hand, two women standing near the entrance quietly moved to the corner to talk. Their voices were not loud, but in the silence, each word seemed to come through clearly. I heard that Mr. Jonah doesn't want to live alone anymore. Yes. People say he hired a widow to look after the house and cook. It's convenient. The house is big. A man like that can't stay alone for long. Martha stood still. Her eyes were fixed on the bag of flour, but the words on the label were blurred. She didn't know if they meant for her to hear, but each word was like a small scratch on her heart. I heard she slept in his ex-wife's room, too. No, I don't know about that. But the men in this area are that good. Who knows? A widow comes to live here. Who can check if she's a maid or what? A half-suppressed laugh fell into the air. Martha clutched the list tightly, making deep creases. She turned around, trying to keep her composure, to ask the shopkeeper about the price of salt. The shopkeeper looked at her for a moment, his eyes complicated, but pretended not to hear. Martha could hear her heart beating clearly. She was no stranger to gossip. Some had talked about her behind her back in another town before. Some said she couldn't keep a husband. Some said she brought bad luck. She had left those places, thinking that a ranch farther away, quieter, would be better off from the prying eyes. Maybe she was wrong. When she was done, Martha walked out of the store with the heavy bag of flour and a few other items. She tied them carefully to the back of the wagon and sat down. Her hands were shaking slightly. The horse shook its head and neighed softly. Martha stroked its neck gently, as if to reassure herself. On the way back, the wind whipped her face, clearing her mind, but the careless words stuck in her head. People thought Jonah kept her because he needed a woman to replace him. People thought she was clinging to a widower for a home. Whether the words were true or not, it still hurt. She thought of Jonah, of how he barely mentioned her coming to the ranch. Deep down, Martha knew he had given her shelter and work, and it was a favor. She had worked hard to prove she wasn't a burden, but if people saw her as a temporary presence, a blemish on his name, then did her presence make Jonah bow to gossip? The thought made her chest ache. As Martha wobbled back down the dirt road, Jonah Hale stood by the barn with Caleb at Hale Creek Ranch. Caleb told Jonah some of the stories from Silverbrush, his voice half joking, half serious. He said there was talk about Jonah keeping a woman in the house. Jonah leaned against the fence and listened quietly. Caleb looked at his friend, waiting for a response, a denial, an anger, or at least a defense of Martha. But Jonah said nothing. He just looked out at the field, where the golden grass stretched and swayed in the wind. "Everyone always has something to say," Jonah replied, his voice so calm it was almost cold. Caleb frowned. He said slowly that Martha wasn't what people said she was, that she was level-headed, hard-working, and didn't seem to want to take advantage of anyone. Jonah didn't disagree. He knew better than anyone what Martha had done for the house in such a short time, but knowing that made it harder for him to say anything. Well, because once he spoke up to defend her, it was no different than admitting that she had a place in his heart. Jonah's silence disappointed Caleb, though he didn't say so. He just nodded, then turned the conversation back to the animals. But a ripple had begun to form in Caleb's heart. He was worried for Jonah and for Martha, because rumors don't kill people outright, but they slowly erode people's peace. As Martha's wagon pulled into the ranch drive, Jonah straightened. He saw her hunched over, her hands loosely gripping the reins, but not loosely either. Martha stopped the wagon, got off to tie the horses, and then carried in each bag. Jonah stepped forward to help her lift the sack of flour from the cart. His hand brushed hers for a split second, a brief contact that startled Martha, who flinched back. Jonah noticed, but didn't know what to say other than ask if she was tired. Martha shook her head and said everything was fine. She walked quickly into the house. Jonas watched her back, his heart in turmoil. He didn't know how the words from Silverbrush had reached her, but he guessed Martha had heard at least some of them. That explained the look in her eyes, a look that seemed to be a little like shame, even though she had done nothing wrong. He clenched his fists involuntarily, as if he could grasp the things that were loose in the air. Inside. Martha put down the bag of flour and leaned against the cabinet for a moment to catch her breath. She didn't cry. Tears were something she had used up too much over the years, and now she didn't want to waste them on the world's half-hearted words. But there was one thing she couldn't deny. She was beginning to believe that she was just a name lost in this place, a shadow of someone else who could easily be replaced. And in that moment, for the first time since arriving at Hale Creek Ranch, Martha quietly thought about leaving. The journey from Hale Creek Ranch to Silverbrush was not a long one for someone accustomed to the West, but for Martha Lee, it was still enough silence to allow her thoughts to wander from safety. The dirt road wound gently through the sunburned grass, rutted in places by the wagon wheels. With each jolt, Martha tightened her grip on the rope that held the rice bin to her back. Jonah gave her some money, told her to buy flour, dried beans, and a little salt. He didn't say much, just said that if she got tired, she could stop at the little inn at the edge of town. Martha nodded, looked at his seemingly emotionless face, and silently got into the old carriage. She felt both grateful and like she was going far away from a place she wasn't sure she belonged. Silverbrush appeared ahead, as Caleb always described it. A few low wooden houses with tin roofs, a tavern, a general store, a small church leaning slightly against a row of sparse trees. Time in such places did not move quickly, but news traveled faster than the wind. When Martha pulled up in front of the grocery store, she took a breath before getting out. She wasn't one to draw attention to herself. The moment her hand touched the doorknob, a small bell on the wooden frame jingled. Inside, the smell of sugar, flour, and old leather mingled. The store owner, a plump, middle-aged woman, recognized Martha as new to the area. She smiled politely and asked where Martha worked. Martha answered that she cooked and helped out at Hale Creek Ranch. That one statement made the atmosphere in the room slow a beat. Another woman picking her way around the corner turned, her eyes filled with undisguised curiosity. An old man near the scale looked up, then pretended to be busy with his bag of beans. No one spoke at once, but Martha was used to that kind of silence. She had lived in smaller places than this, and always recognized the moment her name began to slip into someone else's conversation. The shopkeeper asked a few more simple questions, like if Jonah needed anything else, how the animals were doing. They were normal questions, but there was a desire to glean information from them. Martha answered them simply, without adding anything. She felt her heart beat a little faster. As she was reviewing the list in her hand, two women standing near the entrance quietly moved to the corner to talk. Their voices were not loud, but in the silence, each word seemed to come through clearly. I heard that Mr. Jonah doesn't want to live alone anymore. Yes. People say he hired a widow to look after the house and cook. It's convenient. The house is big. A man like that can't stay alone for long. Martha stood still. Her eyes were fixed on the bag of flour, but the words on the label were blurred. She didn't know if they meant for her to hear, but each word was like a small scratch on her heart. I heard she slept in his ex-wife's room, too. No, I don't know about that. But the men in this area are that good. Who knows? A widow comes to live here. Who can check if she's a maid or what? A half-suppressed laugh fell into the air. Martha clutched the list tightly, making deep creases. She turned around, trying to keep her composure, to ask the shopkeeper about the price of salt. The shopkeeper looked at her for a moment, his eyes complicated, but pretended not to hear. Martha could hear her heart beating clearly. She was no stranger to gossip. Some had talked about her behind her back in another town before. Some said she couldn't keep a husband. Some said she brought bad luck. She had left those places, thinking that a ranch farther away, quieter, would be better off from the prying eyes. Maybe she was wrong. When she was done, Martha walked out of the store with the heavy bag of flour and a few other items. She tied them carefully to the back of the wagon and sat down. Her hands were shaking slightly. The horse shook its head and neighed softly. Martha stroked its neck gently, as if to reassure herself. On the way back, the wind whipped her face, clearing her mind, but the careless words stuck in her head. People thought Jonah kept her because he needed a woman to replace him. People thought she was clinging to a widower for a home. Whether the words were true or not, it still hurt. She thought of Jonah, of how he barely mentioned her coming to the ranch. Deep down, Martha knew he had given her shelter and work, and it was a favor. She had worked hard to prove she wasn't a burden. But if people saw her as a temporary presence, a blemish on his name, then did her presence make Jonah bow to gossip? The thought made her chest ache. As Martha wobbled back down the dirt road, Jonah Hale stood by the barn with Caleb at Hale Creek Ranch. Caleb told Jonah some of the stories from Silverbrush, his voice half joking, half serious. He said there was talk about Jonah keeping a woman in the house. Jonah leaned against the fence and listened quietly. Caleb looked at his friend, waiting for a response, a denial, an anger, or at least a defense of Martha. But Jonah said nothing. He just looked out at the field, where the golden grass stretched and swayed in the wind. Everyone always has something to say. Jonah replied, his voice so calm it was almost cold. Caleb frowned. He said slowly that Martha wasn't what people said she was, that she was level-headed, hard-working, and didn't seem to want to take advantage of anyone. Jonah didn't disagree. He knew better than anyone what Martha had done for the house in such a short time, but knowing that made it harder for him to say anything, because once he spoke up to defend her, it was no different than admitting that she had a place in his heart. Jonah's silence disappointed Caleb, though he didn't say so. He just nodded, then turned the conversation back to the animals. But a ripple had begun to form in Caleb's heart. He was worried for Jonah and for Martha, because rumors don't kill people outright, but they slowly erode people's peace. As Martha's wagon pulled into the ranch drive, Jonah straightened. He saw her hunched over, her hands loosely gripping the reins, but not loosely either. Martha stopped the wagon, got off to tie the horses, and then carried in each bag. Jonah stepped forward to help her lift the sack of flour from the cart. His hand brushed hers for a split second, a brief contact that startled Martha, who flinched back. Jonah noticed, but didn't know what to say other than ask if she was tired. Martha shook her head and said everything was fine. She walked quickly into the house. Jonas watched her back, his heart in turmoil. He didn't know how the words from Silverbrush had reached her, but he guessed Martha had heard at least some of them. That explained the look in her eyes, a look that seemed to be a little like shame, even though she had done nothing wrong. He clenched his fists involuntarily, as if he could grasp the things that were loose in the air. Inside. Martha put down the bag of flour and leaned against the cabinet for a moment to catch her breath. She didn't cry. Tears were something she had used up too much over the years, and now she didn't want to waste them on the world's half-hearted words. But there was one thing she couldn't deny. She was beginning to believe that she was just a name lost in this place, a shadow of someone else who could easily be replaced. And in that moment, for the first time since arriving at Hale Creek Ranch, Martha quietly thought about leaving. The kitchen at Hale Creek Ranch grew dark, but not so dark that Martha needed to turn on a light. The light from the window illuminated familiar objects. She stood by the sink, her hands still slightly powdered. The cool air from the distant mountains touched her skin, making her shiver. Her whole body felt like it was shrinking. The silence was different now. It was no longer peaceful, no longer comfortable. It was like something was slowly filling the room, forcing Martha to listen to her own heartbeat. She took the towel from the hanger and wiped her hands slowly, without really concentrating. The words from Silverbrush still rang in her head, persistent like the sound of a broken string, but still vibrating. When Jonah entered the room, his boots made a faint sound on the wooden floor. Martha flinched, but quickly hid her reaction. She turned to put the salt shaker back on the shelf, pretending to be busy. Jonah looked at her for a few seconds. The seconds were so long that even he felt like he was standing in one place for too long. "What's the matter, Martha?" His voice was low, not harsh, but with something like reserve. Martha paused, but didn't turn around immediately. She knew Jonah could see the unease in her demeanor, but she couldn't help but feel the rumors tearing her apart. She just wanted to keep her dignity intact, even if it was just a thin shell. "I'm fine. Just tired from the ride home," she replied, her voice low and broken. Jonah heard the awkwardness. He felt as if a heavy stone had been placed on his chest. He was used to simple conversations, without having to guess. But with Martha, things were different. She was a woman of few words, and it was her reticence that made Jonah want to understand, but also more afraid of misinterpreting. He leaned closer, asking if anyone in Silverbrush was bothering her. Martha didn't answer right away, not because she was afraid to say so, but because she knew such things weren't worth worrying about for Jonah. He had too much on his plate already: the cattle, the fields, and a loss that had never really left him. "No, sir. Nothing. Just a few words." That stopped Jonah. It was the insignificant words that hurt the most. He knew because he had been there, but he didn't know how to get Martha to open up, because they both had doors they'd locked for years. He told her to go to bed early. Martha nodded, but did not meet his eyes. The avoidance made Jonah feel as if he had lost something fragile in this house. It made him slow down, stand a moment longer in front of the kitchen door before leaving. As the door closed behind Jonah, Martha sank into a chair, her hands clutching the hem of her apron. She closed her eyes. For the first time since arriving, she felt like she truly didn't belong. In the front room, Jonah stepped out onto the porch. The sky was darker than usual, the clouds rolling in as if holding back the wind. Jonah leaned against the porch pillar. He was not one to let his emotions get the best of him, but tonight he knew he was losing his cool. Rumors. They said whatever they wanted about him. But if it hurt Martha, what would he do? He wasn't used to comforting. He wasn't used to expressing. He'd lived so long in solitude that all things emotional were a language he didn't speak. Jonah went back into the house, determined to ask Martha directly what she had heard. But when he entered the kitchen, Martha was gone. She must have gone upstairs. The kitchen was as quiet as it had been when she first came. The familiar silence made him feel a sudden fear, afraid that Martha was withdrawing, afraid that the silence was a signal that she was withdrawing. Jonah sat down on the wooden chair at the table and rubbed his forehead. He wanted to speak, but the words he had planned always fell on deaf ears. He had always held Martha with kindness, never thinking of holding her with more. But today, for the first time, Jonah felt something slipping away from him. Upstairs, Martha sat by the window of her small room. The thin moonlight filtered through the wooden frame onto her face. She reached out to touch the old scarf on her pillow, the only thing she had brought with her from her previous home. It smelled of a past she did not want to remember, but did not dare to forget. She wondered if her presence at the ranch would cause Jonah trouble. She didn't want anyone to think he hired her for anything other than a job. She didn't want a decent man to bow to the vicious world. And what hurt her most wasn't what people said about her, but the feeling that Jonah might believe any of it. There was a soft knock. Martha turned, startled. It was Jonah. He didn't enter, just stood in the doorway, his eyes searching for an answer he didn't know how to ask. If anything happens at Silverbrush, you can tell me, Jonah said, his voice low but not hard. Martha pursed her lips. She wanted to say she was fine, but Jonah's eyes made it impossible to lie. There were some unpleasant words. I heard them talking about you and me. Jonah sighed slowly, not a helpless sigh, but the sigh of someone trying to understand how to approach a soul too wounded. She doesn't care what they say. I don't care about me, but I'm afraid those words will affect you. I don't want you to be gossiped about because of me. Jonah looked at her for a long time. There was no anger in his eyes, only a light, lingering feeling like a gust of wind. You are not my burden, Martha, not one bit. Martha bent down, clutching her lap. She hadn't heard anyone talk like that in a long time. The words made her want to cry, but she controlled herself. Jonah wanted to take a step closer to her, but before he could say anything more, Martha turned away and spoke in a low voice. Thank you. But sometimes, the kindness of others isn't enough to keep someone around if their presence makes things difficult. Jonah stood still. The words seemed to pull him into a bottomless pit. He understood what it meant. Martha was preparing to leave, and that was something Jonah never thought he would fear. The small room was so quiet that Martha could hear her own breath vibrating softly in her chest. Her last words seemed to push the door between them a little further shut. Jonah stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders still, like someone who has seen something he cannot keep. He tried to say more, but the words wouldn't form. Martha bowed her head slightly in anticipation, but when Jonah remained silent, she knew the conversation couldn't go any further. She tugged at the edge of her robe, bowing in apology. Jonah understood. He stepped back, leaving enough room for her to close the door. The door clicked against the wood, a faint click that echoed like a cold seal. Martha leaned her forehead against the door for a moment, breathing deeply. She didn't want to leave, but she couldn't let herself be an excuse for anyone else to get hurt, especially Jonah. The man had suffered too much loss to count. In the outer room, Jonah stood still, his hands clasped together as if holding on to something unattainable. He walked slowly down the stairs, like a man walking in darkness. Though the house was dimly lit, each step he took was heavy, as if he were dragging along words he had never spoken. In the front room, the wooden chair Jonah always sat in, looking down at the valley, was still there. He sat down, leaning slightly as if trying to find calm in his breathing. Jonah had never thought Martha's presence could create such a drastic change in this house. He was used to silence, but the silence when Martha was sad made him unable to stand still. Jonah wondered if he had hurt her more than the rumors. He was not good at expressing himself, not good at explaining, and sometimes his silence cut into people who were already sensitive to abandonment. Jonah felt a pain in his chest as if someone was squeezing it. A breeze blew through the window, making the curtains flutter. Jonah looked up at the lawn beyond. He remembered Martha's first voice in the kitchen, soft as a palm leaf. He remembered her leaning over the stove, her hands making simple, comforting dishes. Jonah knew better than he cared to admit that the house had changed because of her. But how could he say that when he himself didn't know how to deal with his emotions? He was afraid that he wasn't kind enough, not safe enough to keep a woman like Martha. She had been through too much. One careless word from him would be enough to make her think that she had no place in this house. Jonah stood up and went out onto the porch to get some air. Tonight, Hale Creek Ranch BR was lit up by a few dim lights in the distance, where Caleb was tending the horses. He looked out at the vast expanse he had known all his life, but he felt as if he were at a crossroads, not knowing which way to go. Upstairs, Martha sat by the window, fiddling with an old towel. She remembered the places she had been, the places she had left, the places she had been forced to leave. Martha had lived her life the way people expected her to, keeping quiet, enduring, trying not to bother anyone. But each time she did so, she left a part of herself behind. Martha looked out into the yard. The moonlight cast a muted glow on the barn roof. Below, Jonah stood against a porch pillar, his shadow stretching across the ground. He looked lonely, but not weak. Lonely like a man so used to bracing himself against the wind that he can only stand alone. Martha put her hand to her chest. She knew there was something growing inside her, tender and painful, wanting to run and retreat at the same time. She was afraid that staying would create more gossip, afraid that Jonah would feel compelled to defend his honor. But what she feared most was that Jonah would look at her and realize she wasn't worth keeping. Jonah finally returned to the house from the porch. He stood in the middle of the living room, looking over the stairs as if considering knocking again on Martha's door. But his Western pride held him back. Jonah Hale was not used to showing weakness. He also had no idea if Martha wanted to hear more from him right now. Jonah turned away, but stopped halfway. He exhaled sharply through his nose, like someone preparing to ride into a real rainstorm. Then he turned, gripping the handrail, and climbed the stairs one step at a time. Each step was a battle between his pride and what he knew he could not ignore. As he approached Martha's room, he heard her breathing, slow and even, but not sleepy. He raised his hand, but his fingers touched only air. Jonah swallowed, trying to muster his courage. He knew that if he left now, some things would never be undone. Jonah knocked, very softly. Martha opened it. She was a little surprised to see Jonah standing there, his hands loosely folded across his stomach, as if he didn't know where to put them. I don't want you to misunderstand, Jonah said, his voice low and slow. Martha didn't answer, but her eyes revealed an undisguised expectation. I don't want outsiders to make you think that your presence is making things difficult for me. If anything makes you think that, it's my fault, not yours. Martha took a deep breath. Those words loosened a knot in her chest, but much remained untangled. I'm just afraid. Staying here will put more burden on you, she said, her voice softening. Jonah shook his head. If there was anything I wanted to do, it was to help someone feel like they weren't alone. Martha bowed her head at the words. She did not cry, but something like warmth spread through her heart, making her hands tremble slightly. The two stood there, saying nothing more. Not too close, but not as far away as before. After a moment, Jonah tilted his head slightly, his voice lower. If she ever had to leave, I wanted to know it was her choice, not because she feared what people would say. There was silence. Martha looked at him for a long time, and for the first time since she had heard the rumors, she did not feel alone. Martha stood before Jonah, her hands clasped together, her knuckles white with the effort of keeping her composure. The breeze from the hallway carried the scent of hay and old wood. In that moment, she saw the outline of a man who had lived more years holding back than breathing. Jonah stood there, tall but not imposing. Instead, he looked like a man who wanted to say more than the words allowed. Jonah's eyes lingered on her face longer than usual. He was searching for something, a reassurance, a sign that Martha hadn't closed her heart to him. But Martha looked down, as if just looking at him would bring back the turmoil she'd been trying to contain. Jonah took a slow breath. I knew I wasn't good at saying what I needed to say, but I didn't want her to think I was a burden. Never. Martha listened, but it was hard to believe. Not because Jonah was insincere, but because she was used to being left out, used to being seen as a shadow wherever she went, a temporary presence rather than someone who belonged. She searched for the right word. I never meant to be a bother. Jonah took a step closer, very slowly. Enough for Martha to realize he didn't want to push her, nor did he want her to back away any further. Trouble was something I had never thought of talking about with her, Jonah said softly. There were some things, if I lost them, I was afraid I would never get them back. The words fell in the small space between them like a slight tremor. Martha looked at him, her eyes trembling slightly. She had heard many flowery words, heard many people make promises only to turn their backs on her when she needed them most. But Jonah was different. He did not know how to speak sweetly. His words were dry, short, a little awkward. But it was that awkwardness that created a weight in her heart that she did not expect. Jonah continued, not wanting to let the silence get the better of him. Having just mustered up the courage to speak, I was used to being alone. Sometimes I thought my life was over. Then you came, quietly, but everything in this house changed. Martha heard his voice crack. She realized he was confessing something he had been holding back for months. There was something in Jonah's breathing that felt like an old wound opening a crust. I was just doing my job. Martha's voice was small, but this time there was no evasion. No. Jonah shook his head. If it were, I wouldn't be standing here saying things I've never said to anyone. Martha felt her hands tremble slightly. She turned away, trying to control her emotions. But Jonah noticed he didn't touch her, just stood close enough that his breath grazed the air around her. Martha, what people say out there doesn't concern me. What concerns me is what keeps you up at night. What makes you sad? Martha closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to hold back a tear. The window behind Jonah shook slightly as the wind blew in. The small sounds blended into a familiar, sad soundtrack. I'm afraid, Martha said softly. Afraid that I'll stay, and one day he'll think I shouldn't be here anymore. Jonah paused. The words hit him where he was weakest. He felt like he should answer, but the words stuck in his throat. He didn't know how to explain that his greatest fear in life wasn't keeping someone. It was losing someone without ever showing him how he truly felt. He struggled to find a word strong enough to counter her worry. If I wanted her to leave, I would have said so months ago. But it never happened. It never even crossed my mind. Martha opened her eyes. There was truth in Jonah's gaze, and compassion, and something deeper she dared not touch. A strangely warm silence flowed between the two. It was no longer as heavy as before. It was like a pause for both of their hearts to find a clearer voice. Suddenly, from the yard below, a short neigh sounded. Martha jumped. Jonah cocked his head to listen. The distant sound of an iron gate opening made him straighten up. It was an unusual sound, and Jonah was not one to ignore any strange signs around the farm. He looked at Martha, his voice low, but not urgent. "Someone's coming at this hour. Let me go down and see." Jonah turned a few steps and stopped. He turned his head toward Martha, his eyes holding a small questioning look. "We're not done yet." Then he did turn and go. His steps were firm and strong. Martha stood by the door, one hand gripping the wood frame lightly. His words warmed her heart in a way she hadn't been prepared for. In the courtyard below, the silhouette of a man on horseback appeared. Jonah hurried down the steps. When he realized who it was, his expression changed. Not anger, not fear, just anticipation. "Caleb?" Jonah's voice hardened just a fraction. "What were you doing back at this hour?" Caleb hopped down from the saddle, his expression uncharacteristic. He kicked the grass at his feet and walked over to Jonah. "I met someone from town talking about Martha. I thought you should know about it." Jonah looked at Caleb, eyes narrowing. What Caleb glanced briefly toward the second-story window, where the light in Martha's room was still on. They said a stranger was asking about her, someone from wherever she'd lived. Jonah fell silent. His whole body seemed to be forced still. Caleb saw the tension. "I don't know who it was, but you need to be prepared. He said he would be here for you, and soon." Jonah swallowed slowly. Not jealousy, not resentment. It was the deepest fear of all Martha might be pulled back to the place that had hurt her so much she had left everything. Upstairs, Martha stood by the window. She watched Jonah and Caleb talk, but couldn't hear a word. She felt a pang of unease creep into her chest, though she didn't know why. A door had just opened between the two of them, but out there, another door was about to swing open in a way neither of them wanted. Martha looked down from the small window of her room, where the pale yellow light of the porch light cast shadows on two figures talking. Jonah's posture was as hard as a wind-worn rock. Caleb, on the other hand, seemed to be carrying some heavy news. Martha's heart skipped a beat at that moment, for no apparent reason. She saw Caleb tilt his head to look up at her room, and Jonah turned around, his eyes scanning the window as if holding something fragile in the darkness. She gently drew the curtain down, her hand trembling slightly. Something touched a worry that had lain dormant in her heart for months. A worry about the past. A worry that the safety she had begun to believe in could be shattered by the appearance of an unexpected person. Down in the yard. Jonah folded his arms, the muscles in his arms bulging with tension. Not from fear, but because he knew the woman on the second floor had had enough in her life, and he didn't want anything to do with her. Caleb exhaled heavily before continuing. "The man didn't give his name. He just asked if she was there. The way he asked made me feel uneasy." Jonah stared at the ground as if trying to quell something burning in his chest. What did he look like, a man about our age? His face was a little sunken, but his eyes were sharp. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a kind of annoying quality to it. Jonah was silent for a long moment. He knew the kind of man Caleb described. The kind of man used to controlling people with his silence and his gaze. The kind of man who could make Martha shake without touching her finger. Jonah squinted toward the distant trail. The quiet of the ranch tonight was no longer the quiet he was used to. Caleb put his hands on the horse's reins. "I'll keep an eye out for the road, but you better be ready. Whoever it is, he'll be back." Jonah nodded, but his expression didn't change. Only his eyes grew colder. "Thanks. Caleb, go get some rest. I'll take care of the rest." When Caleb left, Jonah stood alone in the yard, not in a hurry to go inside. The wind blew through the hedges, rustling the dry grass. The sound reminded him of Martha burying herself in the kitchenette, trying to soothe the rough days with the scent she created. The image made Jonah squeeze his hand. He knew he couldn't let anyone scare Martha anymore. Finally, Jonah turned and walked into the house. His face was pensive and determined in the soft light. As he climbed the stairs, each step echoed evenly, as if addressed to the small room above. Martha opened the door before Jonah could knock. She stood there, her hands gripping the edge lightly. Her eyes asked everything. Jonah saw her worry and stepped in slowly, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't feel pressured. "Is something wrong?" Martha asked, her voice soft and tense, like a string pulled too far. Jonah paused, then nodded. "Someone is looking for you. I don't know who he is yet, but I want you to know first." Martha held her breath. Her heart clenched. What Jonah looked straight at her, his voice slow but clear as if carved into the air. She was not alone. Martha touched the doorframe gently to steady herself. She was still, not from fear, but because Jonah's words had just touched a soft spot in her heart, a place she had locked away for years. "I don't want to cause any more trouble for this ranch." Her voice was hoarse. "I understand I'm just a hired hand. There's no reason for you to—" Jonah took a half step forward, as if to cut off the sentence that made his chest sink. "She was more than a hired hand. Not to me. Not to this place." Martha's eyes widened. Jonah continued, his voice growing deeper as he said the words he had been holding back for months. "When she walks into this kitchen, I realize I've forgotten what it feels like to have a human presence in my home. She brings this place alive, in ways I can't describe. And if her past returns, I'll stand between it and her before it can reach her." Martha pulled her arms to her chest, as if to contain the warmth that had just burst forth. Jonah Hale, the coldest man in Hale Creek Ranch, had just said the words she had never dared to hope for. But Martha looked down again, her voice shaking even more. "He didn't understand. That man didn't come because I was important. He came because I was convenient. If he found me, things would get complicated." Jonah tilted his chin up, his eyes darkening. "Well, let me make this clear to you. Whatever his reason for coming, I'm not letting him take you anywhere." The space became thicker. In the silence, both of them could clearly hear their own heartbeats. Martha looked up, meeting Jonah's eyes. For the first time, she saw more than just protection in him, but something deeper, like a spring running through the stone that encased him. Jonah stepped back so she wouldn't feel pressured to answer. He placed his hand on the door frame and spoke softly but firmly. "You should sleep. When he comes back, let me face him first. I want you to stay where you're safe." Martha pursed her lips. She knew Jonah cared, but she also knew he was hiding something else, something she wasn't yet brave enough to believe. Jonah left the room slowly. When the door closed behind him, Martha stood still for a long moment. She didn't know what the future held, but she did know one thing, and it made her heart swell in the darkness. For the first time in years, someone told her she didn't have to hold the world up alone. Also downstairs, Jonah stood against the wall, his eyes closed for a few seconds. He took a deep breath, as if preparing for the inevitable. The image of Martha standing before him was still so clear that it made his heart feel heavier. Then he opened his eyes, and in the silence of the house, Jonah Hale decided that if Martha's past had tracked to the ranch door, then he would become the door that past could never pass through. Jonah lay awake for a long time in his large, cold bed. His large room was bare of all things, as if he had wanted to keep everything so quiet that nothing would remind him of his former life. But tonight, the silence was unfamiliar. It was strained to an uncomfortable degree by thoughts of Martha. He turned to look out the window. The faint moonlight cast a hazy shadow over the distant trees, like a broken memory. Jonah wondered who the man was. It wasn't the threat that bothered him most. He'd faced many men. What bothered him was the thought that Martha might be afraid, might tremble at the sight of a figure who had made her life so heavy, and it made his chest tighten. Finally, Jonah sat up. He couldn't lie still. Over the years, he had learned to face trouble head on, but this time, he felt more compelled to prepare than to risk. He put on his coat and went downstairs. The kitchen still had the small yellow light that Martha left on every night. It was a simple habit, but it was enough to make Jonah feel that this place was no longer as cold as it used to be. As he stood in front of the wooden table, his eyes accidentally stopped on the small handkerchief Martha had left in the corner of the table. The fabric was pale, simple but clean. Jonah unconsciously reached out to touch it lightly, then pulled back as soon as he realized his heart softened. He couldn't allow himself to be vague for too long. Someone was looking for her, someone who could bring bad things. And Jonah Hale wouldn't let anyone disturb the peace Martha had found. A soft sound of footsteps on the stairs made Jonah turn. Martha stood at the bottom step, her hand clutching the door as if to keep herself from walking out. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and her eyes were sad, but no longer as secretive as before. Jonah spoke first. She wasn't asleep. Martha looked at the light on the tile floor. I couldn't sleep. Something was bothering me. Jonah moved closer, but stopped far enough away. She was worried about that man. No. Martha shook her head slightly. I was worried about what he had just said before leaving the room. Jonah was silent, surprised by what she chose to say. Martha spoke, her voice soft but firm. He said, I don't have to face it alone. I've heard that many times. But then people leave. I'm afraid to believe it again. Jonah leaned forward a little, so that his eyes were level with hers. His gaze was not urgent, not demanding. It was an invitation for her to see his honesty. I don't promise anything I can't keep. His voice was hoarse but steady. If I say I'm here, I mean I'm here. Martha pursed her lips as if struggling with disbelief. Jonah noticed the slight movement. He knew she had lived so long on guard that her heart was on guard. He continued, more slowly. If that person really comes for you, I want you to let me stand in front. I don't want you to go through what happened again. Martha closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, her gaze was different, no longer filled with fear, only deep concern. Did he think I was so weak that I would hide behind him? Jonah shook his head immediately. No, I think she's brave. But sometimes the bravest people are the ones who have suffered the most. Martha paused at the words. She could not remember a time in her life when anyone had seen through her so well. She was a quiet, reserved woman, but Jonah had read her silence. She took a step out of the darkness of the stairs, toward the kitchen. I had someone who wanted to control me. He wanted me to follow, to obey, to bow down. When I left, he saw it as a betrayal. If he really came up here, he wouldn't let it go easily. Jonah heard each word like a tearing wound. Who was that? Martha was silent for so long, Jonah thought she wouldn't speak. Then she took a deep breath. His name was Royce Madden. He was the one person I trusted not to hurt me. Jonah narrowed his eyes. Royce Madden. The name was sharp as a knife, he asked quietly, but there was restraint in his voice. He treated her badly. Martha didn't shed a tear. She just nodded. He controlled my every move. Stopped me from seeing friends. Stopped me from having a voice. He didn't hit me, but his words made me disappear from myself. Jonah felt his hands ball into fists. He had seen cowardly men use their power to keep others in fear, but the thought of one such man in Martha's life made him choke. Martha looked straight at Jonah, not shying away for the first time. What do you think I should do? When he wants to pull me back, Jonah didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, enough for Martha to feel he saw her not as someone to protect, but as someone he respected. She didn't have to run anymore. She didn't have to hide anymore. This was her home if she wanted it, and if he came, I would tell him so. Martha's eyes widened. Jonah's words were a confirmation she had never dared to accept for herself. Her home. The concept was so foreign it made her throat tighten. She asked softly, "Why do you care so much about me?" Jonah looked at her for a long time, and this time, he didn't hide what he'd always kept. Because she made me feel alive again. Because I didn't want to see her disappear from this place. Martha clutched the edge of the table. Her heart was pounding, not with fear, but with a warmth greater than she had ever been prepared for. The kitchen fell silent. So silent that they could hear each other's breathing. A sudden noise from outside made them both jump. The urgent sound of horse hooves hitting the ground echoed through the crack in the door. Jonah spun around, his face flushed. Martha instinctively put a hand to her chest. No one said it, but they both knew. The unexpected had arrived sooner than they expected. The sound of hooves pounding against the ground echoed like a hammer to Martha's heart. She stood rooted to the spot in the kitchen, and Jonah walked toward the front door. His shoulders tensed as if his entire body were on alert. The air in the house was thick, like a fine layer of dust from the past had been stirred up. Jonah held up a hand to signal Martha to stay back. She didn't object, just took a step back, but her eyes followed his every move. The hoofbeats stopped, leaving an eerie silence on the porch. Jonah opened the door. The wind carried the scent of hay and road dust, mixed with the presence of a man standing beside a muscular black horse. He was tall, lean, and cold as a storm-hardened branch. His face was bony, his eyes narrow and sharp as knives. He wore no cowboy hat like the men around him, but his hair was disheveled, as if he had come here not to blend in, but to quell something. Royce Madden. Jonah didn't call his name, but from the look in the two men's eyes, there was no need to. Royce tilted his head to look at the house. Then his eyes stopped on Jonah. He smiled slightly, a smile that carried no goodwill. "I heard this place belongs to Jonah Hale." Royce's voice was not loud, but there was a dry quality to it that made others feel an invisible pressure. Jonah did not answer immediately. He stood tall, his body radiating the natural steadiness of a man accustomed to the sun, the wind, and the harsh life of the West. He asked in a low voice, "Who are you looking for?" Royce glanced toward the doorway behind Jonah, as if sensing the presence of the person he was tracking. The look made Jonah lean slightly, unconsciously blocking the space inside the house. "I'm looking for a woman," Royce said slowly. "Her name is Martha Lee." A silence stretched between them. Jonah didn't turn, but behind him, Martha heard every word. Her chest tightened. A painful memory rushed back, like a cold touch to flesh. She didn't back away, but her hands clenched. Jonah kept his gaze calm but hard. For what Royce raised an eyebrow. His tone was commanding. "This was between me and her." Jonah replied immediately. If it involved Martha, it was no longer his business. Royce's eyes darkened. "So she was here?" Martha's legs went weak at the question. Jonah kept his eyes on Royce. He spoke each word with such intensity that it was almost as if he were speaking to the ground. Whether she was here or not, he had no right to be in this house without permission. Royce gave a cold smile. Jonah Hale, the man the whole area considered upright, was now hiding my woman behind his back. For the first time. Jonah's voice turned sharp. She wasn't his. Royce's lips curled, as if that confirmed his intentions. He took a step toward the porch, his boots making an unpleasant clicking sound on the wooden steps. Jonah stood in the doorway, his hands slightly relaxed, but his gaze unafraid of any threat. "I came to take Martha home," Royce continued. "She owes me an explanation." Martha shivered. Jonah still didn't turn around, but he spoke loud enough for her to hear. What she owed him no longer mattered, because she wasn't coming back. Royce tilted his head, his voice low but sharp as steel. "You think you can keep her, Jonah Hale." This time, Jonah took a half step forward, his footsteps echoing like thunder buried in the ground. "I don't hold anyone back, but this house protects its own." Martha heard that, and her whole body melted in a heavy emotion. He belonged to him. She had never heard anyone say that to her before. Royce looked at Jonah as if measuring his strength. He took a deep breath, then suddenly lowered his voice to a dangerous pitch. "I wasn't leaving until I saw Martha," Jonah replied without hesitation. Then he would leave empty-handed. Royce took a step back, his gaze sliding across the porch like a knife through water. Then he took the reins and pulled the horse closer. He spoke, his voice restrained, but clearly threatening. "I will come back. And when I do, you will not be standing as firmly as you are today." He turned and mounted his horse, his eyes glancing up at the second-story window. Martha retreated into the shadows instinctively. Royce saw. His lips curved into a cold smile. The horse neighed softly before he jerked the reins and rode away. His figure disappeared down the trail, leaving a trail of sound that carried into the night like a warning of a storm. When all was quiet, Jonah didn't come back in immediately. He stood a few more steps, his eyes on the spot where Royce had disappeared, as if making a commitment to himself that was greater than words. Finally, he turned and closed the door. It closed slowly, as if Jonah wanted to hold the space just a little longer to make sure Martha was safe. In the kitchen, Martha stood still, her hand on her heart. When Jonah entered, his eyes met hers. He saw fear, but he also saw something else lurking between them, a trust she didn't easily trust. Jonah asked softly, "Are you okay?" Martha nodded, but her voice trembled as she asked again, "He will come back." Jonah stepped close enough that she could hear his deep, even breathing. "Maybe, but next time. I wouldn't let him get so close to the house." Martha looked at him a long time. To her, Jonah was more than just someone trying to protect her. He was the last bastion she had ever dreamed of having. She wanted to say something deeper than fear, but her voice caught. Jonah understood. He didn't press her. He just placed his hands on the edge of the table, his voice low as he embraced the space around her. "Martha, I want you to remember, this is no longer a place you have to run from." Her eyes moistened slightly at the words, not because she was weak, but because what Jonah had just said was like soft ground she could place her trust on without fear of it breaking. At that moment, in Royce's old kitchen with its yellow light, amidst the gentle wind still carrying the dust of the road, a new truth was formed. Martha is no longer just a cook, and Jonah is no longer just a ranch hand. Between them, a bond has begun. Quiet, but undeniable. The air in the cabin still reeked of the encounter. Jonah stepped back from the doorway, his shoulders stiff as if still in a protective stance. Martha stood behind the kitchen counter, her hands on the edges of the napkin she was unconsciously clenching. Anyone who has spent years being threatened by a man who entered their life knows the feeling. It's a quiet tension, a thin thread that stretches from the heart to the chest and tugs at every turn. Jonah looked at her for a long moment, as if to make sure she was still holding her own against the stirrings of her memories. He moved closer, slowly, giving Martha time to catch her breath. His voice was low, warm enough to soothe, but there was a grain to it, a sign that he was still alert to every possibility. "Martha, you don't need to explain anything right now." She nodded slightly, but her eyes still held a hint of confusion. "I thought he wouldn't find me." Her voice seemed to slip through old wounds. I had moved far away from the old area, changed my route, avoided all the familiar people, and yet... Jonah put his hand on the back of a nearby chair, close to her, but not touching. Royce had found her because he hadn't let go of the past, and she, Martha, she had let go. That was what mattered. That made her blink. No one had ever told her that letting go was a victory. A longer silence fell between them. Martha put her hand on the scarf, not squeezing it this time, but stroking it gently, as if to calm herself. She looked at Jonah, her gaze both grateful and a little hesitant. There was one thing she hadn't dared to say that encounter. The way Jonah had held her like a human shield had touched something deep inside her, but she was afraid that saying it too soon would make things unnatural between them. She was afraid that Jonah would misunderstand that she wanted him to protect her, when what she really wanted was to be able to stand by him without being a burden. Jonah saw the struggle growing in her eyes. He calmly pulled up a chair and sat down, keeping a safe distance between them. "If you want to talk, I'll listen. If not, I'll stay right here." Martha sighed softly. "I didn't know where to start." Jonah nodded encouragingly. "Start with what scared her most. That usually paved the way for the rest." In that moment, Martha was no longer a woman running from the past. She was a woman standing on the border between darkness and light. On one side were years of fear. On the other was the first step of another life. She leaned her hand lightly on the table and spoke in a low, even voice. "Royce had been my husband's companion when he was alive. When he died in an accident, he came to my house often, under the guise of helping. But then, he began to see me as something he owned." His words were tinged with control. His eyes were always watching. Uninvited visits. I had reported him to the local police, but he had not committed any specific violations. All he felt was that I had no breathing space. Jonah listened, and his eyes darkened. He had threatened her. Martha nodded, wordlessly, but enough to let me know that if I didn't leave the area, his grip would tighten. I had to choose to leave before I was trapped. I thought I had won my freedom, but seeing him standing here in the ranch yard, everything inside me was pulled back. Jonah tightened his grip on the chair, then spoke slowly but firmly. "He won't be able to do anything here. Not while I'm standing in this house." Martha looked at him. Jonah didn't use a consoling tone or romantic promises. He spoke like a responsible Western man. It was his calmness that calmed her. She took a deep breath. "I don't want to get this ranch into trouble because of me," Jonah answered immediately. She wasn't the problem. Royce was the problem, and that problem was mine to solve. There was one thing Jonah didn't say, but Martha sensed he considered her safety as something that belonged to him in the most natural way, without coercion, without demand. In that moment, all outside sounds faded away. Martha felt her heart stirring. Part of her wanted to believe Jonah. Another part, the part that had been hurt, trembled at the thought of relying on anyone. She whispered, "Jonah, I don't want anyone to get hurt because of me." He looked straight at her. "If anything happens, I want to be the first one to stand up. It's not that you're any weaker than anyone else. It's just that I choose to be in that position." That word, simple as it was, spoke louder than any plea or promise. Martha bent down, her hands clasped together, but this time not with fear, but with the hesitation of someone standing at the door of hope. All these years she had lived like a tree buffeted by storm after storm. Only recently, at Hale Creek Ranch, had she felt some safe ground to take root in. Jonah saw that she was silent for too long, and he stood up, worried that the conversation had exhausted her. But Martha called softly, "Jonah." He stopped. "Thanks for standing in front of the door. Thanks for not leaving me alone." Jonah turned, his eyes softening. No one should face things alone. Martha, especially something like this. The space between them softened like a warm blanket. It was not hasty love. It was not weak reliance, but two hearts that had endured too much loneliness, finding a common breath in the peaceful silence typical of the West. Outside, the wind swept through the lawn, carrying with it the echoes of the deep night. Inside, the two people had no idea that this quiet moment would be the beginning of a change greater than anything they could have imagined. Darkness blanketed Hale Creek Ranch like a thick blanket, but inside the cabin, the two people still held the warmth of their conversation. Martha leaned against the window, her hands resting lightly on the rough wood frame. The yellow light fell on her shoulders in soft, dim patches. Jonah was still there, a few feet away, silently watching her like the most patient watchman she knew. He didn't push, didn't ask, just left enough space for Martha to breathe. It was this compression that made her feel strangely at peace. A woman who had lived in silence to avoid a pair of shadowy eyes finally had a place to stand, without fear of being bound by another's gaze. Martha leaned her forehead against the cool glass. There were trails of steam from her breath. She ran her fingers over the mist, unconsciously erasing some old memory. Martha spoke, her voice gentle but with a deep undertone. "I didn't think he was paying attention to me anymore. I thought I was just a passing concern in his eyes," Jonah replied, leaning forward slightly. "Controlling people don't let go easily. They believe others exist to answer to them, not to live their own lives." Martha closed her eyes. Jonah was so right it made her shudder. Royce had looked at her like she owned something. Not out of love, not out of pity. He simply took her presence in his life for granted. A man like Royce couldn't bear to have anything out of his reach. She turned back to Jonah. He was still standing there, his expression calm. But there was something real and deep in his eyes. No impulsiveness, no anger, just a steadfastness Martha knew she could rely on without fear of it disappearing. Jonah asked softly, "Do you want me to take you somewhere else? If you don't feel comfortable staying here?" Martha replied almost without thinking, "No, I don't want to run anymore." The words came out so quickly that she was surprised. Martha squeezed her apron lightly. Noah saw her reaction, and he didn't avoid her eyes. He understood. She had been running half her life, and for the first time, she wanted to stop. Jonah walked slowly to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He spoke slowly, as if each sentence was measured so as not to upset Martha. "If you stay, I will keep you safe. But let me be honest. That won't end with Royce's visit. A man like him doesn't back down after being stopped once." Martha knew that, and it troubled her, but not paralyzed her. Jonah wasn't creating illusions. He was presenting the truth, and she appreciated that. She asked, her voice low, but with a layer of self-control, "So how does Jonah think I should prepare?" He answered without hesitation. "First, don't be alone until you're sure. If you go into the backyard or the shed, tell me or Caleb. And inside, keep the door locked when I'm not downstairs." Martha listened, feeling as if she were being taught to stand up again after years of being forced to bend down. Not to lean on him, but to walk with him. Jonah continued, and she needed a break. Things like this were confusing. Martha smiled slightly, a thin but genuine smile. "I'm not sure I slept well. Jonah?" He nodded slightly. I didn't expect her to fall asleep just yet. Just don't let fear get a foothold in her head. Her eyes widened at the remark. Jonah Hale was not a man of flowery words, but his words always hit places she thought had long been hardened. Martha took a deep breath, then asked what had been bothering her for so long. Jonah, on the porch, when Royce said I was his, why did he react so strongly? Jonah paused, not because he was angry, but because the question touched on something he had been holding back. He didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the door, where Royce's shadow had stood. A flicker of pain crossed his eyes. But then he spoke, his voice low and earthy. I can't stand it when people treat you like an object. And I can't stand it when they think they have the right to touch your life. Martha felt her heartbeat change. Not quick, just a deeper beat. Jonah continued, I don't want you to feel like you belong to anyone. Martha, you have the right to stand in this world without anyone else making decisions for you. Something like a spark of light entered her heart, a kind of respect she had never been treated with, not even by her husband. Confused, she looked down, then looked up again as if checking to see if she had heard correctly. Jonah looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't hide what he was really saying. Maybe I was overreacting, because I didn't want to stand by and watch someone take away what I was starting to value. Martha's heart stopped, not because the words were so sudden, but because they matched what she had been secretly feeling all along. A warmth spread through her chest, slow but powerful. Martha looked at Jonah, and in that moment she saw no shadow of Royce, no threat, no sense of being hunted. She saw only a man speaking the truth with unflinching eyes. Martha touched the edge of the table, as if needing support to keep herself from shaking. Jonah. He took a half step closer. Not close, not fast. Just enough to show he was ready if she wanted to continue. Martha swallowed. I wasn't used to someone taking my side. I didn't know what to do with this feeling, Jonah replied softly. You don't have to do anything. Just know that I'm here. The sentence was light, but warm as a fire in a fireplace on a long winter night. Martha held his gaze longer than usual. The distance between them had never been so comfortable, not because they were no longer afraid, but because they had begun to share the burden. After a long moment, Jonah said, You should rest. I'll keep watch outside. Martha nodded, but before leaving the room, she spoke softly, as if from the heart. Jonah, thank you, not just for today. He returned her gaze with a soft yet deep look that made Martha feel as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly become firmer. No one knew how important that was to her. As she climbed the stairs, Martha realized she wasn't shaking as much as before, and Jonah stood at the foot of the stairs, watching her until she was out of sight. Outside, the wind blew through the eaves, carrying with it the familiar chill of the west. But inside the cabin, for the first time in years, Martha felt her heart find a safe place to rest. The upper floor of the wooden house felt as soft as a thin layer of mist. Martha stood in the hallway, her hand resting on the time-polished wooden railing. Below, the yellow light cast enough light for her to see Jonah's shadow still there. He didn't look up, but the way Jonah stood, leaning slightly, his hand on the edge of the table as if ready to react to any sound, told her that her peace was being silently guarded by a man. Martha stepped into the room. The door closed behind her, but instead of feeling lonely, she felt her heart slow with her breathing. Martha pressed her back against the door and placed a hand on her chest. Her heartbeat was no longer as rapid as before, but still carried the shock of the encounter. Feeling Jonah on her side, quiet but sure, made the layers of fear melt away bit by bit. Royce flashed through her mind like a shadow from an old memory. The man who had once made Martha flinch at the sound of his voice no longer filled her sky, not because Royce was any less dangerous, but because for the first time in her life, She was no longer alone in the darkness. Martha walked to the bed by the window and sat on the edge of the mattress. Moonlight fell through the window, casting a soft, silky sheen over her hair. She let out a long, but not heavy breath. She tried to calm her mind, but every time she closed her eyes, Jonah's voice returned. "I'm here." The firmness of the sentence made Martha feel a strange heaviness in her chest. Not uncomfortable, just an emotion she rarely dared to confront. She was used to keeping things bottled up inside, until they stifled her voice. But Jonah's presence was opening doors she thought had been locked forever. Martha sat still for a long time before deciding to get up and go downstairs again. Not because she was afraid. It was because there was something she had been holding back for years. And today, facing Royce, she painfully realized she had kept it in for too long. She needed to say it, not for comfort, but to be seen for who she really was. When Martha reached the bottom of the stairs, she stopped. Jonah was sitting by the large window, a steaming cup of coffee at his elbow. He turned at the sound of footsteps, his eyes unsurprised. He seemed to know Martha would return. She moved closer, each step slow and deliberate. Jonah spoke softly. "Can't sleep." Martha shook her head slightly. "It wasn't that I couldn't sleep. It was just, I think I have something to tell you." Jonah sat up straighter. He didn't push, didn't press, just a presence as calm as an autumn hillside. She sat in the chair across from him, her hands clasped together. There was a pause before Martha found her words. "I've lived in silence for so long, Jonah, so long that I almost forgot I had the right to speak." Jonah's eyes rested on her face, not with pity, but with understanding. He waited for her to continue. Martha looked down at her hands. "There were years when I thought my voice was worthless. It was the same whether I said it or kept it. No one listened. No one wanted to understand." She looked up, her eyes red, but not a tear fell. It made me feel small in my own home. And when I left that place, I carried that feeling with me here. I thought that if I just kept quiet, I wouldn't cause trouble for anyone. Jonah spoke slowly, his voice low, making the room feel warm. Silence was a form of protection, not a shame, but too much silence could make a person forget what it was worth to live. Martha pursed her lips, as if a hand had been placed gently on her heart. He understood what she had left unsaid. She took a breath, then spoke truthfully. "Jonah, you probably don't know how important this is to me. But when Roy stood in the doorway, it wasn't that I was afraid he'd find me. It was that I thought, if no one was with me, maybe I'd just go back to being silent like before. I'd let him decide everything for me again." She stopped, her voice shaking. "But he was there, and he reminded me that I was no one's shadow." Jonah looked at her for a long moment. There was something quiet and restrained about his face, as if he had been waiting for this moment before he knew it. He said, "I stood there because I wanted to, not out of duty, not out of kindness, but because I respected her. That had never changed since she had come into my kitchen." Martha choked. She had never heard anyone speak to her like that. No strings attached, no demands, just a heartfelt acknowledgement from a man who didn't flaunt his emotions, but was true to them. She asked, almost in a whisper, "Jonah, why would someone like you want to stand with me?" He replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because there are things you can't choose. Where your heart is up to you. All I know is that when I see you trying to live a peaceful life, I want to protect that with everything I have." The words took Martha's breath away, then melted into a warm wave that spread throughout her body. There was no boasting, no pretty promises, just a sincerity strong enough to touch a wound that had healed but still left a scar. Martha bowed her head, her voice almost choked but not breaking. "Jonah, I didn't think I had the courage to let anyone see me again. But you made me want to try again." to come out of the shell I'd locked myself in. Jonah pressed his hands lightly against the edge of the table, as if holding back something he was afraid to say too soon. He asked softly, "And what do you want me to know most tonight?" Martha looked up. Her eyes were bright in a way she hadn't even recognized. She put her hand to her chest, where for years it had felt a little hollow. "I want you to know that your presence makes me feel alive, and I know that if I keep it inside, I will lose it again like I have lost so many other things." She paused, then said something she had pushed away so many times, but this time she let it be. "Jonah, I believe in you, and I'm starting to feel something for you, something I haven't allowed myself to feel in years." The space was silent, but it was not emptiness. It was the silence of two souls who had just passed through a door of no return. Jonah looked at Martha as one sees light in a valley after a long winter. He did not hug her, nor did he reach out to take her hand. He only said one sentence, but it was enough to make Martha's heart beat with renewed life. I waited for her to say that, and I didn't go anywhere. The moment Jonah said that, Martha's mind suddenly became as quiet as a lake after a storm. Not the silence of fear, but a silence so quiet that she could feel her own breath. She looked at him, her eyes not avoiding him, as if trying to engrave in her heart a sincerity rarely seen in a Western man who had experienced so much loss. Jonah sat there, steady as a tree in a valley. He didn't push Martha to come closer, nor did he retract what he had just said. In the soft yellow light, he looked a little tired, but not tired from physical exertion, but tired of someone who had just touched something so important that his heart was racing. Martha touched the edge of the table. She knew she had just crossed a line from which there was no turning back. Yet the relief that coursed through her made her realize that this was the right choice. She no longer wanted to live as a silent shadow. After a moment, Martha spoke. "Jonah, what you just said made me feel seen in a way I didn't expect." Her voice was low, but not shaky. Jonah replied, "I don't mean to upset you. I'm just stating the facts." Martha sighed. "I knew, and that made me appreciate it." She rose from her chair. Her steps were slow, but steady, as if she had found a way she had been missing for years. Jonah watched. His eyes narrowed slightly, both attentive and as if he wanted to make sure Martha wasn't suffering. He called her name, his voice deep with the richness of old earth. "Martha." She stopped and waited for him. Jonah looked deep into her eyes, his usual reticence giving way to quiet determination. "There's one more thing I want to say, but I'll only say it if you're strong enough to hear it." Martha swallowed, then replied, "Go ahead." I no longer wanted to back down from the truth. Jonah stood. His tall frame dwarfed the room, but he did not threaten her. He stepped closer, stopping far enough away that Martha still felt free. He spoke slowly, each word sinking in like water seeping into the ground. "Royce will be back." Martha flinched slightly, but did not dodge. Jonah continued, "I looked into his eyes. He wasn't the type to give up until he got what he wanted, and if he believed she was his, he would try again." Martha looked down at her hands. The fear was still there, but it no longer held her in the same grip. She took a deep breath. "I understood," Jonah added. "It's not him I worry about. It's the guilt you'll carry when it happens. Martha, you didn't do this. What he did, it was him, not you." Martha closed her eyes for a moment. For years she had lived with the feeling that she was a burden, always afraid of bothering anyone. But now, when Jonah said that, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She looked up. "I won't run again. I know I've said this many times tonight, but I want you to know that I mean it." Jonah nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "I understand. And I believe you. A soft knock on the side door made them both jump. Everything in the air changed. Jonah leaned over, peering out the window, then looked back at Martha. He spoke softly. "Stand behind me." Martha obeyed, taking a step back. The silence was as tense as a bowstring. Jonah walked to the door, turning the handle slowly before opening it slightly. Caleb stood there, holding a bundle of straw and a small oil lamp. His face was etched with worry. He said, his breath still ragged, "Jonah, I saw someone standing under the north fence for a few minutes. I couldn't tell because it was too dark. I was about to go closer when it disappeared." Jonah tightened his grip on the door handle. His gaze hardened. "What color shirt do you see?" Caleb shook his head regretfully. "All I could see was a figure and the long shadow of a hat. But it felt not like he was there." Martha clutched her stomach, where a slight contraction was spreading. She looked at Jonah. He saw the change in her eyes and put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't assume the worst." Caleb looked at Martha, then turned to Jonah. "Do you want me to check around the ranch?" Jonah nods. "Go with Sam. Have him take the horse out. Come around from the west trail. Don't confront anyone. Just check the area." Caleb responded with a decisive nod and left. When the door closed, the room fell silent. Martha took a deep breath, but it seemed to be getting heavier. Jonah turned to her. He touched Martha's arm lightly. "It didn't mean Royce. Strangers sometimes wandered through the ranch. Don't panic." Martha looked at him, her eyes a mix of fear and newfound confusion. "I wasn't panicking. I just didn't want to put him and everyone else in danger." Jonah placed his hands firmly on the table, as if to make sure she understood what he was about to say. "We weren't here out of obligation. Martha, you're part of this place, and I—" He paused, his emotions faltering. "I won't let anyone touch you, even if it means facing Royce again." Martha froze at the words. Fear and gratitude mingled in a deep, unnamed emotion. She didn't want Jonah to take any chances, but she also knew he meant what he said. She stepped closer to Jonah, only an arm's length away. "Jonah, I know you're strong, but I don't want my emotions to cost you." Jonah looked at her a long time. "Emotions don't make me weak. They help me know what's worth protecting." At that moment, Martha looked down, afraid that if she looked any longer, her heart would confess everything. But then she looked up, and it was as if she had found courage in the deepest part of herself. "Jonah, what scares me most isn't that Royce will come back." She put her hand to her chest. "What scares me is that if he gets hurt, I don't know how I'll live." Jonah paused. Martha's words touched a place he hid. It was a quiet admission, but it made his heart vibrate like a well-struck string. He took another half-step closer. "Martha, you are not alone anymore, and neither am I." In that moment, in the golden room, both of them understood that what they felt for each other was no longer just vague feelings. It had become a bond strong enough to overcome what was about to happen. The cabin seemed to shrink after Jonah and Martha's conversation. They stood so close that a sharp breath could erase the distance between them. However, neither of them was in a hurry. Some emotions, once acknowledged, take a very slow beat to sink into the heart. Jonah looked at Martha with eyes that were no longer hidden. All the holding back, all the things he had told himself to keep quiet so as not to pressure her, were no longer needed. But Jonah stood still, letting Martha be the one to choose what to do next. The silence was soothing. No tension, no reluctance. It was like standing before a valley opening up through the mist, knowing that there was a new path ahead, but needing to take a breath to steady one's steps. Martha put her hand to the left side of her chest, where her heart was beating steadily, but more strongly than usual. She looked at Jonah, the smallest smile she had ever given him, like a spring emerging from dry earth. I never thought I could feel safe with anyone, but with him, I found it didn't scare me like it used to. Jonah could feel it in her face. He spoke in a low voice. You don't owe me anything. Whatever you choose to do, or avoid, is your choice. Martha shook her head. It wasn't the debt. It was the years I hadn't lived my life to the fullest. I saw that with Royce. I'd let him convince me the silence was the only way to survive. She took a deep breath. But I didn't want to live like that anymore. Jonah's heart skipped a beat, not because she said anything grand, but because Martha's acceptance of the truth about herself was so gentle and real. He asked, Martha, what do you want now? The question made her look up, her eyes reflecting the firelight, not shimmering, just warm and deep. Martha took a step toward Jonah, only half an arm's length away. I wanted to believe what I had just said. I wanted to try standing next to someone without shrinking away. I wanted to give my heart a chance to beat for something good. Jonah looked at her for a long moment. He was probably trying to keep his emotions from surging too high, so as not to scare Martha. But the corners of his eyes softened in a way that could not be hidden. He said, If you choose to move forward with me, I will not make you regret it. Martha trembled, but not with fear. She spoke softly. I chose that. A layer of silence fell, but it was the silence of two souls that had just found common ground. There was no longer any distance to hide, no longer any reason to turn away. Jonah raised his hand slowly, as if asking her without saying a word. Martha looked at his hand, looked into his eyes, then nodded slightly. Jonah placed his hand on her cheek, a touch as light as the late spring breeze touching a flower about to bloom. Martha leaned her cheek against his hand, not avoiding it. She closed her eyes for a brief but deep moment, not to run away from the emotion, but to allow herself to feel it. When Martha opened her eyes again, Jonah realized something had changed inside her. Not a new person, but Martha returning to herself, a version that had never been allowed to live. Jonah whispered, Would you like to rest for a while? I'll stay down here until Caleb comes back with the news. Martha shook her head. I want to stay here a little longer. With you. Jonah smiled, a rare but warm smile. So she stayed. So did I. The two of them sat down near the window. No one needed to say anything more. They just silently watched the shadows of the treetops outside, flickering in the yellow light. It was not a love that rushed like a great waterfall, nor was it a love driven by loneliness. It was the gentleness of two hearts that had been hurt enough to understand that peace did not come from forgetting the pain, but from finding someone who could make the pain no longer dominate them. A moment later, Martha turned to Jonah. He replied without turning away. I'm listening. Martha took his hand. No shaking, no hesitation. I want you to know, I haven't loved anyone in years. Not because I'm incapable of love, but because I don't believe I'm worthy of love. She looked into his eyes. But today, as he stood between the door and Royce, I realized I wanted to believe again. And it wasn't anyone else. It was him. Jonah closed his eyes for a moment, as if the words touched a place where his heart contracted in gratitude. He opened his eyes and replied, I closed my heart for a long time too. I don't think I could open it after all the pain I've felt. But you, he paused, searching for the truth. You remind me that the heart only tires when it has nowhere to go. A stream of warmth spread between the two, like a small light, but enough to light up the whole room. When Caleb returned, he confirmed there was no sign of the fence. Jonah thanked him and closed the door. Martha felt her shoulders relax, her heart beating steadily in a sense of security she thought she would never have again. Jonah looked at Martha. Are you okay? Martha nodded slowly. I was fine, and I thought I was ready for whatever was coming. Jonah took a step closer to her. We face it together. no more alone. Martha smiled kindly, a smile she hadn't seen in a long time in the mirror. I believe you, Jonah. He placed his hand on the back of hers, squeezing gently, and I believed her. No long-distance promises, no grand declarations of love, just two souls brave enough to open their doors to each other. In a moment when the land of the West was so quiet they could hear their own heartbeats, that night marked the rebirth of both of them. A new life did not begin with a loud voice, but with a choice for each other sincere enough to overcome all the storms ahead. The story of Jonah and Martha reminds us of something simple, yet profound. Age does not limit our ability to love, and the human heart is never closed forever. No matter how much we have suffered loss, been misunderstood, or lived in silence for too long, we all deserve a chance to bloom again. At 60 or so, we are not looking for loud brilliance. What we need is peace to lean on, someone quiet enough to understand, patient enough to stay, and sincere enough to open up the rest of our lives. No one is too old to be loved. No one is too late to be healed. The most important thing sometimes is just a small choice. Dare to speak your heart. Dare to believe one more time, even though your hands are still shaking and your heart is still tired. Thank you for staying until the end of the story. If you find it meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue with me on other healing journeys. I hope you always find someone who makes your life warmer.